They don't have to ban your gun to take it away. And right now, we're watching that playbook unfold. While most people argue about assault weapon bans, Chicago, a block of state attorneys general, and groups like Everytown are dragging Glock into court over cheap Glock switches and rising ATF seizure numbers. I'm making this because those cases and the new Glock V-Series redesign aren't just about one pistol. They're a test of whether officials can bleed gunmakers into submission without voting on a gun ban. If they succeed, it won't just cost companies money. It will decide which handguns you and I can buy and how far the government can chip away at the Second Amendment. In this episode, I'll walk you through who is suing, what Glock is changing, how this echoes the National Firearms Act of 1934, and what's at stake for gun owners across America. All right, so let's start with what's actually changing here. Because this isn't the same old ban this gun, ban that gun debate we've all heard 1,000 times. For years, gun control has been about lists of prohibited rifles, magazine limits, and scary cosmetic features. Now the pressure is shifting to something a lot quieter and, in my view, a lot more dangerous, using civil lawsuits and public nuisance theories to bleed gun makers instead of trying to ban you from owning a handgun directly. The target they picked is Glock, because Glock pistols are everywhere, in law enforcement holsters, in nightstands, and yes, in crime gun trace data that anti-gun politicians love to wave around. That's the frame for what we're seeing right now. The city of Chicago has sued Glock, claiming the company endangered residents by selling pistols that can be converted with cheap little switches into illegal machine guns. A coalition of state attorneys general sent Glock a formal preservation letter, warning of devastation and public terror from converted Glocks, and telling the company to save documents in anticipation of litigation. Not long after that, the New Jersey Attorney General and the Minnesota Attorney General filed their own civil suits, built on the same idea. Glock supposedly profits from a design that is too easy to convert. So the gun itself becomes the nuisance, not the criminal who bolts on a part that was already illegal under federal law. Baltimore has now jumped in with a similar lawsuit, pointing to cases where officers recovered pistols with switches that can drive the rate of fire up toward what we'd expect from true machine guns. At the same time, the federal side is not silent. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, and the Department of Justice already treat those little switches and auto-sears as machine guns all by themselves. You don't even have to install the part on a pistol. Just having it in your pocket can be a felony. Over the last few years, federal and local agencies have reported a huge spike in the number of conversion devices they are seizing. And a lot of those are cheap 3D printed parts or imports that never went through any legal channel in the first place. Now, here's where the strategy gets clever. Instead of saying, we have a criminal problem with illegal machine gun parts, let's go after the people making and trafficking those parts. These lawsuits flip it around. They say, no, the problem is that the base Glock design lets that part work in the first place. In other words, the lawful, semi-automatic pistol that millions of people own without ever touching an illegal device becomes the thing on trial. And if they can sell that theory in enough courts, they don't have to pass a federal semi-auto ban. They can just make it so risky and so expensive to offer certain designs that companies quietly pull them from the market. That brings us to the new Glock 5 models you've started to hear about. From the outside, these look a lot like the Gen 5 pistols most of us are used to. Same basic profile, same overall concept. The big changes are inside the gun. Reports from the industry say the fire control parts and the way the back of the slide and frame interface have been tweaked so that existing switch designs won't simply drop in and run. It's not a cosmetic update. It's a structural one, aimed at changing the geometry the bad guys have been exploiting. At the same time, Glock appears to be phasing out parts of its older product line, especially in the United States, and ramping up this new V-Series as the default going forward. Gun control groups are already taking a victory lap over that. They are openly bragging that years of pressure, from public campaigns to quiet meetings to litigation, forced a major manufacturer to redesign a flagship product. And look, I understand why a company, even a big one like Glock, might look at the cost of fighting multiple lawsuits in multiple states and say, maybe we should at least try to get ahead of this. But here's the hard truth. Design changes alone will never fix a problem that is driven by illegal parts and criminals who are already ignoring the law. You can alter the internals all you want, and somebody, somewhere, is going to fire up a 3D printer or a CNC machine and build a device that fits the new shape. So what happens when that day comes? and it will. The same people who are celebrating this V-Series shift are not going to shrug and say, well, we tried. I guess gun control doesn't work. They're going to say, see, even after the redesign these guns are still being converted. Glock didn't do enough. Time for more restrictions. That's the logic buried inside these lawsuits. It's not fix this one problem and we'll leave you alone. It's every time you try to adapt. We'll move the goalposts and use your adaptation as proof that we can push you further. If that pattern holds, the V model is not the end of the story. It's the opening bid. There is also a very practical side to this that hits regular gun owners and the aftermarket. When you change internals in a big way, you risk breaking compatibility with existing holsters, triggers, connectors, sights, and end-to-end armorers tools that people have invested in over the years. Armorers have to retrain. Parts suppliers have to re-engineer. And in states with handgun rosters, like California, we already know what happens when a manufacturer rolls out a new generation. The state just says no, and ordinary citizens are locked into older designs while law enforcement quietly gets access to the newer ones. If the only Glock pistols that make business sense to sell are the V-Series, but roster states refuse to list them, that effectively shrinks your choices without a single new federal statute. To really understand how serious that is, you have to zoom out and look at the pattern in American gun law. This is not the first time the government has tried to get what it wants without saying, we're banning this category of weapon. Go back to the National Firearms Act in the 1930s. After the Prohibition era, bootlegger violence, and headline-grabbing crimes with guns like the Thompson submachine gun, Congress didn't technically outlaw machine guns, short-barreled rifles, or silencers. What it did was wrap them in registration requirements and slap a $200 tax on every making and transfer. In 1934, that kind of money was absolutely enormous, the equivalent of several $1,000s today. For a normal working person, that tax might as well have been a brick wall. So, on paper, those items were still legal. In reality, for most Americans, they were off the table. That's the same style of indirect pressure we're watching now. Back then, it was a tax and paperwork designed to make the right too expensive and too intimidating to exercise. Today, it's lawsuits and liability theories designed to make certain core handgun designs too risky to produce. The tool set is different, but the mentality is the same if you can't ban it outright, regulate it, tax it, or sue it until almost nobody can afford to touch it. And remember, none of this stops with Glock. The same theory being tested in these cases can be applied to any popular semi-automatic pistol. We're already seeing political attention land on guns like Ruger's new RXM, with officials hinting that if a firearm can be converted, even with an illegal device, the manufacturer should be on the hook. If that becomes the norm, the incentive for any company to design a robust, modular, easy-to-service handgun goes straight down, because every feature that makes it user-friendly can be twisted into an argument that it's too easy to misuse. For everyday gun owners, the stakes are pretty simple. Do you want a marketplace where you can choose from a wide range of proven, reliable handguns that have evolved over decades? Or do you want a marketplace where only the designs that have survived waves of lawsuits, insurance pressure, and roster politics are left standing, usually the least controversial, least capable, and most compromised options for the companies? The choice is just as stark. Spend years in court arguing about what criminals did with illegal parts, or quietly update your designs and hope you've bought yourself a little peace. And for the Constitution, the question is whether a right that the Supreme Court has recognized as fundamental can be hollowed out through economic warfare instead of honest legislation. That's why I keep coming back to the difference between what the government is allowed to do directly and what it's trying to do indirectly here. Under modern Second Amendment case law, the government is not supposed to treat commonly owned handguns as fringe, exotic items that can be regulated out of existence. These are the very firearms that ordinary people use for self-defense in the home, for lawful carry, and for training. When officials can't win that argument in the open, when they can't pass a straightforward handgun ban, they pivot to pressuring insurers, leaning on banks, and unleashing wave after wave of public nuisance lawsuits until the economics do the banning for them. So, what should a company like Glock do? I'm not here to pretend it's easy. Legal fights cost real money. Smaller manufacturers may not have the war chest to go toe-to-toe with a big blue state attorney general's office. But backing up, I think there are a few principles that matter. First, the industry needs to stop thinking it can appease its way out of this. Every time a redesign is treated as a concession instead of a neutral product update, it sends a signal that lawsuits work. Second, companies need to work together, not just quietly meet one-on-one with hostile regulators. A united front, backed by serious constitutional litigation and by law-abiding customers who understand what's at stake, is a lot harder to pick off than one defendant at a time. And third, all of us, as citizens, need to recognize that these cases are not just about one model marked with a little V on the slide. They are about whether a fundamental right survives only where it is convenient for politicians, or whether it actually limits what government can do when it decides it does not like the tools free people choose to own. At the end of the day, this isn't really a story about one brand or one model number on a slide. It's a stress test of whether your rights live or die based on what criminals do with illegal parts that the law already forbids. If lawsuits and liability games can quietly erase proven handguns like this, they can be turned on any rifle, any shotgun, any company that refuses to bend. So stay alert, stay informed, and stay engaged the right way. Support the people fighting these battles in court. Vote like your rights actually matter. And keep training like your life depends on it. Because one day, it might. If you found this helpful, share it with a friend who carries. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.